February 19th, 1945. The Bay of Bengal. The air is heavy. It tastes of salt, sulfur, and rotting vegetation. To the west, the sun is setting, casting a blood-red light over the dark waters of the mangrove swamp. If you were standing on the deck of a British destroyer that evening looking towards Ramree Island, you would have seen smoke rising from the jungle. You would have felt the vibrations of the tank tracks crushing the earth, but you would not have known that you were looking at the entrance to hell. Ramree Island, a jagged piece of rock and mud off the coast of Burma. For 3 years, the Imperial Japanese Army held this island with an iron grip. It was a vital fortress, a shield protecting their supply lines to the mainland. But by 1945, the tide of war had turned. The British machine was rolling forward, unstoppable, crushing everything in its path. Operation Matador. That was the British plan. It was a masterstroke of military strategy. The Royal Marines landed on the north of the island. The elite Indian infantry landed on the south. Like a giant metal clamp, they began to squeeze, mile by mile, bunker by bunker. Defending the island was the Japanese 54th Division, about 1,000 men. These were not fresh recruits. These were hardened veterans, men who had fought in China, men who had survived the jungles of Malaya. They were led by commanders who lived and breathed the ancient code of Bushido. Surrender is not an option. Disgrace is worse than death. By mid-February, the trap had snapped shut. The British forces had pushed the Japanese to the very edge of the island. Behind the Japanese soldiers lay the open ocean, patrolled by British warships waiting to sink anything that floated. In front of them lay the British tanks, flamethrowers, and machine guns. General Sir Philip Christison, the British commander, knew the slaughter that was coming. He respected his enemy. He did not want a massacre. He sent a message to the Japanese garrison. "You are surrounded," the message read. "You have fought with honor. You have done your duty. Lay down your arms. There is no shame in living." Inside the Japanese command bunker, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and desperation. The officers looked at the message. They looked at each other. To surrender meant they could go home one day. It meant they would see their wives, their children, the cherry blossoms in Kyoto. But to surrender meant betraying the emperor. They made their choice, a choice that defies logic, a choice that modern minds struggle to comprehend. They would not surrender, and they would not die on the beach. They would escape. But there was only one way out. To the east of their position lay a 16-kilometer stretch of mangrove swamp, 10 miles of mud, 10 miles of twisted roots, 10 miles of black stagnant water that separated Ramree Island from the mainland of Burma. They believed that if they could cross this swamp under the cover of darkness, they could link up with the larger Japanese army on the other side. They looked at the map. The swamp looked like a green smudge, just terrain, just mud. They didn't know that the map was lying. This was not a forest. It was an ecosystem that had remained unchanged for millions of years. The locals called it the Green Hell. It was a place where sunlight struggled to reach the ground, and it was the home of the saltwater crocodile. Pause. Twos. The preparations began at twilight. 1,000 men checked their rifles. They tightened their boots. They wrapped their wounds in dirty bandages. They were hungry. They were thirsty. Many were bleeding from shrapnel wounds. And in the wild, blood is a signal. Blood is a dinner bell. As the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the island into darkness, the order was given. Move out. The column of 1,000 men stepped off the dry land and into the mud. The first step sank to the ankle. The second step sank to the knee. They were walking into a nightmare, and the door was closing behind them. The swamp was alive. It breathed. It shifted. It watched. Within an hour, the Japanese soldiers realized their mistake. This was not walking. This was swimming through glue. The mangrove roots were not like trees. They were like tangled cages. They twisted and turned, forming a labyrinth of wood and slime. To move 10 meters took 5 minutes. Soldiers had to climb over the roots, then drop down into neck-deep water, then climb up again. Imagine the physical toll. You are carrying a heavy rifle, ammunition, a backpack. Your uniform is soaked, your boots are full of mud, and it is pitch black. The canopy of the trees blocked out the moon and the stars. The only light came from the occasional flash of distant lightning. Then came the insects. Clouds of mosquitoes, thick as smoke, descended on the men. These were huge tropical mosquitoes carrying malaria and dengue fever. They swarmed the soldiers' eyes, their noses, their ears. Men couldn't swat them away because their hands were holding their weapons above the water. They just had to let them bite, thousands of bites. Eyelids swelled shut, lips cracked. Scorpions hid in the bark of the trees. Centipedes, long as a man's forearm, floated in the water. Venomous spiders spun webs between the roots, invisible in the dark until they were on your face. But the worst enemy was the water itself. It was brackish, a mix of salt water and fresh water. It was undrinkable. The soldiers were dehydrated from days of fighting. Now surrounded by water, they couldn't take a sip. Some men, driven mad by thirst, tried to drink it. Within minutes, they were vomiting. The salt accelerated their dehydration. The bacteria in the water attacked their stomachs. By midnight, the column of men had stretched out over miles. Discipline began to break down. Officers whispered furiously, "Keep moving! Silence! The British can hear us!" But how can you be silent when you are dragging 1,000 men through slime? Splashing, cursing, coughing. The sound echoed through the eerie silence of the swamp. And then, the hallucinations started. Exhaustion does strange things to the human brain. Soldiers started seeing things in the shadows. Did that log move? I saw eyes. There is something in the water. The officers dismissed it. "It's just the current," they said. "It's just a drifting log. Keep moving." They were wrong. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct. Human beings have a primal instinct that tells us when we are being hunted. The hair on the back of their necks stood up. They felt watched. And they were right. Deep in the murky channels beneath the surface of the black water, vibrations were being felt. The saltwater crocodile, Crocodilus porosus. The apex predator of the reptile world. They can grow up to 23 feet long. They can weigh over a ton. They have sensors in their jaws that can detect a drop of water hitting the surface from 50 meters away. Now imagine the vibration of 1,000 men wading through the water. To the crocodiles, it didn't sound like an army. It sounded like a buffet. The scent of blood from the wounded soldiers drifted downstream. In the water, scent travels fast. From miles around, the predators began to wake up. They slid silently off the mud banks. They emerged from their caves under the roots. They didn't splash. They didn't roar. They simply glided, invisible, silent, deadly. The trap was fully set. The Japanese soldiers were in the middle of the swamp, too far to go back, too far to go forward. They were stuck in the kill zone, and the tide was coming in. 2 Sabres a.m., high tide. The water level rose. The dry patches of mud disappeared. The soldiers were now wading chest deep. This was the moment the crocodiles had been waiting for. It started at the back of the line. A soldier named Private Tanaka was lagging behind. He was wounded. He was leaning against a mangrove root to catch his breath. He looked down at the water. 2 small yellow lights appeared on the surface. He thought it was fireflies reflecting in the water. He didn't realize they were eyes. There was no warning roar, just a sudden explosion of water. A massive head lunged from the darkness, jaws clamped onto Tanaka's waist. The bite force of a saltwater crocodile is 3,700 pounds per square inch. It crushed his pelvis instantly. He didn't even have time to raise his rifle. He let out a single piercing scream, "Tasukite! Help me!" before he was jerked violently underwater. The soldier in front of him turned around. "Tanaka?" He shone his flashlight into the dark water. All he saw were bubbles and a cloud of red blood spreading in the black water. Then it happened to the next man, and the next. Panic spread like a virus. "Enemy frogmen!" an officer shouted. "The British are in the water! Open fire!" The soldiers began firing blindly into the swamp. Flash, bang, flash, bang. The strobe light of the muzzle flashes revealed the horror. In the flashes of light they saw them, hundreds of them. Giant reptiles, some as long as small boats, swarming around the column. The gunfire didn't scare them. It agitated them. The smell of fresh blood sent them into a frenzy. The swamp erupted into chaos. It was no longer an army. It was a stampede. Men scrambled to climb the slippery mangrove roots. They clung to the branches, feet dangling inches above the water. But the crocodiles launched themselves out of the water. They jumped vertically, snapping their jaws, dragging men down from the trees. The sound. Survivors would later say the sound was the worst part. The cracking of bones. It sounded like dry branches snapping in a fire. The death roll. When a crocodile bites, it spins its body violently to tear the meat from the bone. The sound of thrashing water mixed with human screams created a cacophony of hell. One group of soldiers found a small mud bank. They huddled together back to back, bayonets pointing outwards. They thought they were safe on land. But saltwater crocodiles are amphibious. They crawled out of the water. Massive armored tanks. They charged into the group of men. Rifles were useless. Bullets bounced off their thick skulls. It was primal combat. Man versus monster. Dr. Bruce Wright, the British naturalist stationed on a patrol boat miles away, wrote about that night. He said, "The scattered rifle shots in the pitch-black swamp, punctured by the screams of wounded men crushed in the jaws of huge reptiles, and the blurred, worrying sound of spinning crocodiles made a cacophony of hell that has rarely been duplicated on Earth." Think about that. The blurred, worrying sound. That is the sound of flesh being torn apart. The Japanese officers tried to maintain order. "Hold your ground! Die with honor!" But there is no honor in being eaten alive. Some soldiers, realizing there was no escape, chose the only way out. They put the muzzles of their rifles under their chins. They pulled the triggers with their toes. Blam, blam, blam. They preferred a bullet to the teeth. The feast continued for hours. The water turned into a thick pink sludge. The crocodiles gorged themselves, disappeared to swallow, and returned for more. It was an orgy of violence, nature taking its revenge on the war. As 4 a.m. approached, the screaming began to die down, not because the danger had passed, but because the number of living voices was dwindling. 1,000 men had entered the swamp. Now, only the silence remained. Dawn broke over Ramree Island on February 20th. The sun rose, indifferent to the carnage of the night before. The mist lifted, revealing the swamp in the gray morning light. The sky was black, not with clouds, but with vultures. Hundreds of large scavenger birds circled overhead, waiting for their turn. The British patrol boats moved slowly into the mangrove channels. The soldiers on board had their weapons ready. They expected a firefight. They expected snipers hiding in the trees. What they found was a graveyard. The water was choked with debris, backpacks, helmets, rifles, and bodies. bodies that were half-eaten, bodies that were twisted, and on the mud banks, lying in the morning sun, were the crocodiles. Massive, bloated, sleeping. They lay still, digesting the greatest meal in the history of their species. The British soldiers covered their mouths. The smell was overpowering. They searched for survivors. "Is anyone there?" they called out. Silence. Then, movement. Clinging to the roots, shivering, covered in mud and blood. A soldier, then another. They didn't shoot. They didn't try to fight. They just stared with wide, unblinking eyes. Out of the 1,000 elite soldiers who entered the swamp, according to reports, only 20 were found alive. 20. Some historians argue the numbers. Some say 500 died to gunfire and 500 to the swamp. But whether it was 500 or 900, the result was the same: a massacre. The survivors were in shock. They were dehydrated. Their skin was covered in insect bites. But their minds were broken. When the British pulled them into the boats, they wept. They were grateful to be captured, because the British might put them in a prison camp. But the British wouldn't eat them in the dark. One captured Japanese soldier told his captors, "The night, the eyes, there were too many eyes." This event entered the Guinness Book of World Records as the most number of fatalities in a crocodile attack. It remains a story that blurs the line between history and horror. The massacre of Ramree Island teaches us a brutal lesson. We humans think we are the masters of this world. We build tanks. We drop bombs. We draw lines on maps. We think war is the ultimate power. But on that night in 1945, the soldiers of the 54th Division learned the truth. We are small. We are fragile. And we are edible. Nature does not care about your flag. It does not care about your emperor. It does not care about your honor. If you step into the domain of the monster, you are just meat. Today, Ramree Island is quiet. The mangroves still twist like snakes, the mud is still deep, and the crocodiles are still there. They glide through the black water, ancient and patient, waiting for the next mistake. War creates scars on the land and on the soul. But sometimes the deepest scars are the ones left by the teeth of the wild. This is homecoming scars,